A clay tablet cracks under the pressure of a scribe's stylus, and across its surface a familiar disaster begins to take shape. The gods are angry. Humanity has become too numerous, too loud, too disruptive. A decision is made in the divine council. A flood is released upon the earth, and one man receives a warning. He builds a great vessel, seals it with pitch, brings living creatures aboard, survives the rising waters, and after the storm releases birds to search for dry land. For most people, that sequence belongs to the book of Genesis. Noah, the ark, the mountain, the dove, the rainbow. But centuries before the Hebrew Bible reached its final written form, that same structure was already preserved in Mesopotamian literature. It appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of world literature, where the flood survivor is not Noah, but Utnapishtim, and the resemblance is not vague. It is precise enough to be uncomfortable. In the Gilgamesh version, the gods decide to send a flood. One god secretly warns a righteous man. The man is told to tear down his house and build a boat. The boat is loaded with family, craftsmen, animals, and supplies. The waters overwhelm the land. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are released, one after another. A sacrifice is made after survival. The gods gather around the offering. The parallels are so close that when George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, translated the tablet in the 19th century, he reportedly became so overwhelmed that he ran through the room in a state of shock. The ancient text had not merely resembled the biblical flood, it had appeared to preserve an older version of it. And that discovery changed everything, because the Epic of Gilgamesh was not written after Genesis. Its flood tablet belonged to a much older literary tradition, copied in Akkadian, built upon Babylonian sources, and rooted even deeper in Sumerian memory. Depending on which layer is being discussed, the Mesopotamian flood tradition predates the biblical account by many centuries, and in some forms by more than 1,000 years. That alone is extraordinary. But it is not the most important part. The more important part is that the Gilgamesh flood is not the only flood. Buried beneath the famous Babylonian version is an older, stranger, more fragmented tradition. It does not always name Utnapishtim. It does not always preserve the same cause. It does not always present the disaster as the same event. In earlier Sumerian fragments, another survivor appears, often identified as Ziusudra, a king or priestly figure connected to the ancient city of Shuruppak. His story overlaps with the later flood traditions, but it also preserves details that do not fit neatly into the familiar Noah Utnapishtim pattern. And those details matter, because when the flood narratives are treated as a single myth retold in different languages, the differences are often smoothed away. The names are translated into equivalents. The gods are rearranged. The broken passages are filled in using later versions. The entire tradition is compressed into one story. Ancient people remembered a great flood, and each culture adapted it. That explanation is simple. It may also be incomplete. The Mesopotamian material suggests something more complex. Not one flood memory, but two. Two traditions, two layers, possibly two events. One preserved in the well-known Babylonian and biblical forms associated with overwhelming water, divine judgment, a warned survivor, and a vessel. The other, preserved only in damaged Sumerian fragments, connected to an earlier world, an earlier king list, and a decision made in the council of powerful beings later remembered as the Anunnaki. The question is not merely whether there was a flood. The question is which flood the texts are talking about. In the later and more famous account, the cause is often framed as divine irritation or moral corruption. Humanity becomes noisy. Humanity becomes wicked. Humanity disturbs the order of the world. The flood comes as punishment, cleansing, or reset. In Genesis, the language becomes theological and moral. Human violence fills the earth, and God resolves to destroy all flesh except for Noah and those preserved with him. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the reason is more unsettling. Humanity multiplies, and the noise of mankind prevents the god Enlil from sleeping. The flood is not presented as a natural disaster in the modern sense. It is a deliberate extermination measure, debated and enacted by divine authority. In Gilgamesh, the event is recalled through Utnapishtim's testimony. The gods decide the flood in secret, but Ea, or Enki, in the older Sumerian tradition, breaks ranks. He warns the human survivor indirectly, speaking to a reed wall, allowing the man to hear without openly violating the divine assembly's command. This already reveals a split in the divine council. Some powers want humanity destroyed. One power intervenes to preserve it. That conflict becomes crucial when the older Sumerian material is examined. The Sumerian flood story, preserved only in fragments, gives a different atmosphere. Its surviving lines are broken, damaged, and incomplete, but what remains suggests a deeper mythic structure. Before the flood, kingship descends from heaven. Cities are founded. Sacred centers are established. The gods organize human civilization. Then the text turns toward catastrophe. Ziusudra, described as pious and attentive, hears a divine message. A flood sweeps over the land. After 7 days and 7 nights, the sun god Utu appears, and Ziusudra opens a window, prostrates himself, and offers sacrifice. Later, he is granted life like a god and settled in a distant land, often associated with Dilmun, a place of purity, immortality, and Eastern mystery. This looks familiar, but the context surrounding it is not identical. In the Sumerian king list, a separate but related tradition appears. The list names a series of impossibly long-lived kings who ruled before the flood. Then comes a stark line. The flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descends again, and rule resumes in Kish. That line is one of the most important in all Mesopotamian literature. The flood swept over. Not as a moral sermon, not as a family drama, not as a shipbuilding episode, but as a historical divider. Before the flood, kingship belonged to one order of the world. After the flood, civilization began again under a new arrangement. For the Sumerians, the flood was not just a disaster, it was a boundary between ages, and that boundary may not point to the same flood later remembered in the Noah and Utnapishtim stories. The geography is the first clue. The most famous flood explanations often point to Mesopotamia's river plains, where the Tigris and Euphrates could rise catastrophically. In a flat, alluvial landscape, even a regional flood could feel like the drowning of the world. Ancient cities were built close to water because water meant agriculture, transport, and life, but that same dependence made them vulnerable. Archaeology has found flood deposits at several ancient sites, including Shuropak, Ur, Kish, and others. These deposits do not always date to the same period. They are not all one flood. They represent different episodes of inundation, some local, some severe, some separated by centuries. At Shuruppak, the city most closely tied to Ziusudra and sometimes associated with the flood survivor tradition, a major flood layer has been dated roughly to the early 3rd millennium BCE, often around 2900 BCE. It was significant. It disrupted settlement. It left a real geological mark, and it fits remarkably well with the idea of a devastating regional flood remembered in Sumerian tradition. But another possible flood memory lies much farther back. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically across the world. Coastlines vanished, valleys drowned. The Persian Gulf, which today is covered by shallow sea, was once a low-lying basin, possibly containing rivers, wetlands, and habitable land. As the oceans rose, marine waters would have advanced into this landscape, transforming it over generations, perhaps punctuated by sudden surges. If early communities lived there, their world may literally have disappeared beneath the water. This would not have been a 7-day river flood. It would have been a civilizational displacement, a slow or episodic drowning of an entire inhabited basin. It could have driven populations northward into southern Mesopotamia, carrying memories of a lost antediluvian homeland. One flood fits the later ark tradition, a catastrophic river event in the historical cities of Sumer. Another flood fits the older boundary memory, the loss of a pre-Sumerian or early Sumerian world beneath rising seas. When later scribes inherited these traditions, they may not have kept them separate. Stories merge, names change, gods are translated. Oral memory compresses centuries into a single dramatic event, but the older fragments resist complete absorption. They preserve a world before the flood in which kingship descends from heaven, where rulers reign for impossible spans, where divine beings establish cities, and where the disaster does not merely punish humanity, but resets the political and cosmic order. And then something happens in the transmission. The older account fades, the later account survives. Utnapishtim becomes the flood survivor known to Babylon. Noah becomes the flood survivor known to the biblical world. Ziusudra remains in fragments. The Anunnaki Council recedes into theological background. The possibility of an earlier, separate flood is buried beneath a single universal narrative. That burial was not necessarily accidental. Ancient scribes did not preserve stories neutrally. They copied, edited, harmonized, and reshaped them for temples, kings, schools, and priesthoods. A flood caused by human wickedness teaches one lesson. A flood caused by divine politics teaches another. A flood caused by natural catastrophe teaches another still. But a flood caused by a decision of the Anunnaki Council raises a more dangerous question. If humanity was not destroyed because of sin, but because powerful beings chose to erase an earlier order, then the flood was not only a disaster, it was an act of control. A spade cuts into the soil of southern Iraq, and beneath the ruins of one city, a pale band of silt appears between two layers of human life. Above it are pottery fragments, hearths, tools, and the traces of rebuilding. Below it are older floors, older walls, and the remains of a settlement interrupted by water. This is where the argument leaves myth and enters the ground itself. At Shuruppak, one of the most important cities connected to the Sumerian flood tradition, archaeologists found evidence of a major inundation. The city had not simply experienced a little seasonal flooding. A thick deposit of water-laid material showed that something powerful had passed across the settlement, strong enough to interrupt occupation and mark the archaeological record. The date is critical. This flood layer belongs roughly to the early 3rd millennium BCE, often placed around 2900 BCE. That places it close to the world of early dynastic Sumer, the age when cities were rising, kingship was consolidating, writing was becoming more complex, and political authority was being recorded in ways that would later become history, legend, and sacred memory. Shurpak is not just any city. In later tradition, it is the home of the flood survivor. In the Sumerian king list, it is the final city to hold kingship before the Great Dividing Line. The last antediluvian ruler, Ubaratutu, is associated with Shurpak. In other traditions, the flood survivor is connected to that same royal line. This creates an unusually tight convergence. A city linked to the flood in literature, a city named at the end of the pre-flood age, and a city where a real flood deposit was found. That does not prove the legend exactly as written, but it does prove that southern Mesopotamia preserved memories of catastrophic flooding rooted in real experience. The problem is that the same pattern does not appear everywhere at the same time. At Ur, another famous flood deposit was discovered, but its dating and context differ from Shuruppak. At Kish, flood layers appear again, but not necessarily from the same event. Other sites contain evidence of inundation, while some major settlements do not preserve the same signature at all. This uneven pattern matters because it undermines the idea of one single flood covering the entire Mesopotamian world in a uniform geological event. Instead, the evidence points toward multiple floods. Some were local, some were regional, some were devastating enough to destroy settlements and enter collective memory. In a land shaped by rivers, canals, marshes, and flat plains, water did not need to cover the entire planet to become the end of the world for those who lived there. If the horizon was flat, if the roads vanished, if fields became a brown sea, if temples stood like islands and then disappeared, the language of total destruction wouldn't feel exaggerated. It would feel accurate. This explains the later flood tradition well. A major early dynastic flood centered around Shuruppak could have produced the historical core behind Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, and eventually Noah. A royal or priestly survivor, a vessel, rescued animals, offerings after the waters receded, and the restoration of civilization all fit the pattern of a traumatic regional disaster remembered through religious storytelling. But the older layer still does not fit completely, because the Sumerian tradition does not only speak of a flood destroying a city, it speaks of the flood as the line between two ages of kingship. Before the flood, rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. Cities receive kingship from heaven. The order of the world is not merely political, it is cosmic. After the flood, kingship descends again, and the world restarts under different conditions. That sounds less like one river disaster and more like the memory of a vanished world. This is where the Persian Gulf hypothesis becomes important. During the last ice age, global sea levels were far lower than they are today. The modern Persian Gulf was not always a gulf. Much of it was exposed land, a broad, low basin fed by rivers, springs, and wetlands. Some researchers have suggested that this region may once have supported human communities before. Rising seas gradually transformed it into the shallow marine environment known today. If that basin was inhabited, then the flooding of the Gulf was not a mythic exaggeration, it was a physical reality. The water did not merely rise in a single storm. It advanced across generations, swallowing lowlands, forcing migrations, changing river systems, and erasing settlements beneath sediment and sea. To communities living through it, the process could have been remembered as the drowning of the first homeland, not just a flood, but the loss of the world before the world. This older event would not leave the same kind of evidence as the Shuruppak flood. A river flood leaves silt inside a city. A drowned basin leaves its evidence offshore, buried under marine deposits, difficult to excavate and largely inaccessible. Its memory would survive not as a neat archaeological layer between two town levels, but as a myth of origins, a time before the present cities, before normal kingship, before the known order. That is exactly the kind of world described in the pre-flood sections of Sumerian tradition. The kings before the flood are not ordinary rulers. Their reigns are impossible, their cities are primal, their authority is granted from above. Then the flood comes, and the chain breaks. When kingship returns, the reigns become shorter, the cities more recognizable, the world more historical. This is not how people normally describe a recent river flood. It is how people describe a rupture in time. The later Babylonian and biblical versions move the story into moral and theological territory. Humanity becomes corrupt. Humanity becomes noisy. The gods, or God, decide destruction is necessary. One righteous man is spared. The lesson becomes obedience, judgment, and divine mercy. But the older Sumerian fragments point towards something stranger, not simply punishment, but administration. The world before the flood is organized by divine powers. Cities are assigned. Kingship descends. Human society is structured. Then at some point, the council determines that this order must end. The Anunnaki are not background decoration in this worldview. They are the high powers of the divine assembly, the beings who determine destinies, grant authority, and establish the terms under which human civilization operates. In later texts, their roles vary, and their identities shift depending on period and theology. But in the deepest Mesopotamian imagination, divine council decisions are not symbolic. They are the mechanisms by which reality itself is governed. So when a flood is linked to council action, the meaning changes. A natural disaster can be mourned. A divine punishment can be moralized. But a council-ordered destruction implies policy. It implies deliberation. It implies that humanity, or some part of humanity, had become inconvenient to the powers that manage the world. This is why the distinction between the two floods matters. The Shuruppak flood can be placed in the historical landscape of early Sumer. It may stand behind the familiar ark narrative. The warned survivor, the boat, the animals, the mountain, the birds, and the sacrifice. It belongs to the flood that later cultures could retell as judgment and salvation. The older flood belongs to something more obscure. It is tied to the disappearance of an earlier order, the reset of kingship, and the replacement of one age with another. It may preserve memory of environmental catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. It may preserve social collapse in the earliest phases of southern Mesopotamian settlement, or it may combine both into a mythic account of a world deliberately erased. Later scribes inherited all of this. They had fragments, king lists, temple traditions, oral memories, and older myths in multiple languages. They also had reasons to simplify them. A single flood story is easier to teach, easier to copy, and easier to control. One survivor, one boat, one divine decision, one lesson. But the older material was not so simple. It suggested that there had been a world before the official world. It suggested that kingship had been granted, withdrawn, and granted again. It suggested that the gods themselves disagreed. And in the figure of Enki, the god who warns the survivor, it preserved the memory of a breach inside the divine order. One faction decrees destruction. One figure secretly preserves life. That is not merely theology. It is conflict. And if the oldest flood was remembered as the outcome of that conflict, then later editors had every reason to reshape it. The story could remain, but its implications had to be softened. The council could fade into the background. The survivor could become a moral hero. The cause could become wickedness, noise, or divine grief. The older accusation could disappear, because a flood sent to punish human evil reinforces authority. A flood sent to erase an earlier human order calls authority into question. A stylus moves across a fresh tablet, and the older story begins to change under the hand that preserves it. The scribe is not destroying the flood. He is saving it, copying it, carrying it into the future. But every act of preservation is also an act of selection. A broken line can be restored one way and not another. A divine name can be replaced. A local memory can be folded into an imperial theology. A dangerous cause can become a safer lesson. This is how the second flood disappears. Not all at once, not through fire, not through a single decree that orders the tablets erased. It disappears through absorption. The older flood, the one tied to the end of an age, the withdrawal and return of kingship, and the decisions of the divine council, is gradually pulled into the later flood, the one with the boat, the warning, the animals, the birds, and the sacrifice. What remains is familiar enough to survive, but changed enough to obey. In the oldest Sumerian pattern, the flood is not only an act of destruction, it is a transition of authority. Before it, kingship descends from heaven and is placed in cities that seem to belong to a mythic world. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupolk. The reigns are enormous, stretching beyond human possibility, as if the text is not recording ordinary history, but the memory of a different scale of existence. Then comes the dividing line. The flood sweeps over. Afterward, kingship descends again. That phrase is the key. Kingship descends again. If kingship has to descend again, then something more than buildings has been destroyed. The legitimacy of the world has been interrupted. The chain of authority has been broken. The flood is not merely water. It is a reset. Later versions keep the disaster, but change the focus. The story becomes centered on one man's obedience, one vessel's survival, one divine promise, one moral explanation. The audience is not asked to think about the political structure of the pre-flood world. It is not asked why kingship had to be reissued. It is not asked what order existed before the flood, or why that order had to end. The question shifts from who benefited to who sinned. That shift is powerful. In Genesis, the cause becomes human corruption and violence. The flood becomes a judgment against a world that has ruined itself. The moral burden rests on humanity. The disaster is terrible, but it is justified by human failure. Noah survives because he is righteous. The story becomes a foundation for covenant, divine mercy, and sacred law. In the Babylonian tradition, the logic is different, but still redirected. Humanity is too loud. The gods are disturbed. Enlil cannot rest. The flood is extreme, even horrifying, but the problem is still placed in human existence itself. Humans multiply. Humans disrupt. Humans become unmanageable. But beneath both versions is a colder possibility. The earlier flood may have remembered a deliberate termination of an older human order by the powers who governed civilization. Not because humanity had become morally evil in a later theological sense, and not because rivers simply rose beyond control, but because the ruling divine council chose to end one arrangement and begin another. That is the part later tradition has reason to obscure. The Anunnaki, in Mesopotamian thought, are not minor figures wandering at the edge of myth. They are linked to judgment, destiny, underworld authority, cosmic decree, and the deep structure of divine government. When their council decides, reality changes, cities rise, kingship is granted, fates are fixed. The human world operates beneath decisions made above it. So if the flood is attached to that council, it is not random catastrophe. It is policy. And policy leaves motive. What motive could the older story have preserved? One possibility is social control. The earliest memories of Mesopotamia are filled with the language of labor, service, temples, and divine economy. In Atrahasis, humans are created to relieve the gods of labor. They dig canals. They maintain the world. They perform work the gods no longer wish to do. In that framework, humanity is useful, but only within limits. Too numerous, too independent, too disruptive, and humanity becomes a management problem. The flood then becomes an attempted reduction. Not annihilation for its own sake, but a controlled removal of an unwanted population, followed by a new arrangement under stricter conditions. After the flood, the texts introduce limits on human life, mortality, infertility, infant death, and social constraints. The world continues, but humanity's expansion is no longer uncontrolled. The reset is followed by regulation. That detail is easy to miss, but it matters. The flood does not simply end. It produces a new system. This is exactly what would be expected if the older narrative encoded a transition from one form of human existence to another. From a primal age of legendary kings and divine immediacy into the historical age of cities, dynasties, temples, and controlled authority. The geological evidence gives that transition a physical background. The Shuruppak flood may explain the later Ark tradition, a real disaster severe enough to become legend. The drowning of the Persian Gulf Basin may explain something deeper, the memory of lands lost before the known cities, populations displaced, ancient settlements erased beneath rising seas, and survivors carrying stories north into the alluvial plains. When these memories met, they could have fused. A local river flood supplied the dramatic event. A drowned ancestral world supplied the cosmic meaning. Priestly theology supplied the moral explanation. Imperial scribes supplied the final shape. And in that final shape, the two floods became one. This is why Ziusudra matters. He stands at the seam. He is not exactly Noah. He is not exactly Utnapishtim. He belongs to an older Sumerian atmosphere where the flood is tied to kingship, divine decree, and the survival of a sacred remnant from a world before the present order. His story is damaged, incomplete, and difficult to reconstruct, but the fragments are enough to show that something has been compressed. Ziusudra does not merely survive a storm. He survives the end of an age, And after he survives, he is not returned to ordinary life in an ordinary city. He is granted life like a god and placed in a distant, purified land. That is not the ending of a simple disaster tale. It is the removal of a witness. The survivor of the previous world is preserved, but he is also relocated beyond the normal human sphere. Utnapishtim inherits that role in Gilgamesh. He, too, lives far away, beyond the waters of death, unreachable except by a hero, desperate for immortality. He tells Gilgamesh the secret of the flood, but he does not return with him. The knowledge remains at the edge of the world. The survivor knows what happened, but his testimony is isolated. That isolation is part of the pattern. The truth of the flood is never placed at the center of the city. It is hidden in fragments, distant lands, secret warnings, reed walls, and broken tablets. The council decrees destruction in secrecy. Enki warns indirectly. The survivor escapes through coded speech. Later readers receive the story only after it has passed through layers of editing. The flood narrative is built around concealment, and once that is recognized, the missing pieces become as important as the preserved ones. Why does Enki have to warn the survivor in secret? Why does the divine assembly forbid disclosure? Why are the gods later frightened by the very flood they unleashed? Why does the survivor receive immortality only after the destruction is complete? Why does kingship have to descend again? These are not minor inconsistencies. They are traces of an older conflict inside the story. The official decision is destruction. The hidden counter-decision is preservation. The council acts as one voice, but the gods are not united. Humanity survives because someone inside the system breaks the system's command. That is the most subversive part of the entire flood tradition. The human race is not saved because the ruling council changes its mind. It is saved because one divine figure disobeys. Later, theology can transform this into mercy, wisdom, or providence. But in the older Mesopotamian frame, it looks like resistance. Enki does not deny the decree openly. He outmaneuvers it. He speaks to a wall. He uses technical obedience to commit actual betrayal. He preserves life without formally announcing rebellion. That detail survived because it was too central to remove, but its meaning could be softened. The flood could become a test. The survivor could become righteous. The council could become an expression of divine will rather than divine politics. The earlier world could become a vague prelude. The second flood could vanish inside the first. And that may be exactly what happened. The final form of the flood story is not false, it is layered. It contains the memory of real water, real destruction, real trauma, and real survival. But it also contains editorial pressure. It contains theological reshaping. It contains the effort to turn a dangerous memory into an obedient one, because the oldest flood account did not simply say that the world was destroyed. It suggested that the world before ours was deliberately ended. It suggested that authority came from above, was withdrawn from above, and was reissued only after catastrophe. It suggested that humanity's survival depended not on the mercy of the council, but on a breach within it. And if that memory remained clear, then every later king, priest, and empire claiming divine order would inherit an uncomfortable question. If the gods once erased an entire age, what prevents them from doing it again? And if one god had to betray the council to save humanity, then who was humanity really being saved from? The flood happened twice, because the texts remember two different kinds of destruction. One was the flood of water that struck cities, filled plains, buried houses, and left silt between layers of life. The other was the flood of authority, the deliberate ending of an older order, and the rewriting of what came after. The first flood drowned the land. The second drowned the memory, but not completely. The fragments remain. The king list remains. Zeus Sudra remains. The warning through the wall remains. The strange terror of the gods after their own decision remains. The line remains. The flood swept over. And beneath that line is the older story, still waiting in the mud, still broken, still dangerous, still asking whether the greatest catastrophe in ancient memory was not a punishment from heaven, but a decision made there.